Amidst the aromas of Goa and the libraries of Oxford, two souls meet through letters that cross oceans. A young Indian teacher and a British academic defy conventions, prejudices, and distances in a journey that reveals how true love can build bridges between seemingly incompatible worlds. The aroma of fresh fish and the scent of salt pervaded the air as Mira does, just 17, walked barefoot along the beach of her fishing village in Goa. The waves gently broke on the golden sand, bringing with them the boats of her father, Rahul, and the other fishermen who were returning after a night of hard work. The sky began to lighten, painting the horizon in shades of orange and pink, heralding another day of labor. "Mira, come help with the nets," called her father, a man with skin weathered by the sun and hands calloused by daily work with the fishing nets. With a smile, Mira ran to the boat, her feet sinking into the wet sand. She loved the sea, the stories her father told about sea creatures, and the tranquil rhythm of life in the village. Despite the simplicity and financial hardships, there was a richness in her existence that couldn't be measured in coins. At night, in the small wooden hut they called home, her mother, Priya, sewed by the light of a lantern while humming old Indian songs. The smell of curry and spices filled the air, blending with the lingering aroma of the sea. On the worn wooden walls, a simple crucifix reminded them of the region's Portuguese heritage, embraced by the Duz family for generations. "Daughter, you have the gift of letters," Priya said, watching Mira read a worn book she had received from a missionary. "Don't waste that talent." Her father, always practical, added, "Those who learn to wait for the wind also learn to sail. Life is like the sea, Mira, sometimes calm, sometimes stormy, but always in motion." Mira absorbed every word like dry land absorbs water. She studied tirelessly at the village's small school, dreaming of a future where she could do more than just survive. Thousands of kilometers away, in Oxford, England, Edward Hawthorne occupied his usual spot in the university library. At 35 years old, he was respected as a literature professor, known for his brilliant mind and precise analyses of English Romantic poets. His office, filled with old books and valuable manuscripts, reflected the privileged position he held in the academic world. The English sky, permanently gray at that time of year, filtered a pale light through the library's Gothic windows. Edward adjusted his glasses and continued correcting his students' essays, ignoring the clock that announced the end of working hours. There was no rush to return to the empty apartment he called home since his father's death 5 years earlier. "Professor Hawthorne, don't forget the department meeting tomorrow," a colleague reminded him as she passed by his desk. Edward nodded without lifting his eyes from the papers. His life was orderly, predictable, and, although he never admitted it, terribly lonely. He had grown up in a traditional English family, where decorum and emotional restraint were valued more than displays of affection. His mother, Margaret, an elegant and proud woman, managed the family residence with British precision, keeping the Hawthorne traditions alive even after becoming a widow. "Academic excellence is the legacy of our name," Margaret would repeat whenever Edward showed any interest in less intellectual activities during his youth. Thus, Edward grew up surrounded by books and silences, becoming a reserved, rational man, deeply disconnected from his own feelings. He analyzed passion in the poems of Keats and Shelley, but did not know how to recognize it within himself. It was during a university project that fate began to weave its invisible threads. The college started a correspondence program with schools in former British colonies, aiming to promote cultural exchange. As the coordinator of the literature department, Edward received several letters to distribute among the teachers. One of them, however, caught his attention in an unexpected way. The handwriting was elegant despite the simple paper. It was signed only as M. Does and came from a small school in Goa. What impressed him was not the academic content, but the way the sentences flowed with a poetic simplicity he had not encountered in academic circles for a long time. "Here, the sun rises tired, but always returns. I think love is the same," said a passage that remained etched in his memory. Edward replied to the letter formally, but included questions about local life and Indian literature. To his surprise, he received a response quickly. Thus began an exchange of letters that would last for months, gradually revealing the sensitive soul behind those words. Mira, then 28, had become a teacher at the local school after years of study and sacrifice. She had recently lost her father, a victim of a storm that overturned his boat, leaving her only with a wooden crucifix carved by his hands and an urn with his ashes, which she kept as a treasure. Edward's letters brought a new world to Mira, discussions about literature, philosophy, and culture that she avidly absorbed. For Edward, her words were like windows to a simpler and more authentic way of seeing life. When the opportunity to attend a conference on colonial education in Mumbai arose, Edward did not hesitate. He extended his trip to include a visit to Goa, driven by a curiosity he himself didn't completely understand. The humid heat of Goa struck him like an invisible wall when he got off the train. The hum of voices, the vibrant colors of the clothing, the intense aroma of spices, everything contrasted drastically with the restrained England he knew. Following the directions received by letter, he found the small school where Mira taught. She was teaching a group of children to write using colored chalk and crushed shells on wooden boards. Her black hair was tied in a simple braid, and she wore a turquoise blue sari that captured the sunlight streaming through the open windows. When she looked up and saw Edward standing in the doorway, her face lit up with a smile of recognition. "Are you the teacher of the letters?" she asked, standing up as the children watched her curiously. Edward, usually articulate, suddenly found himself at a loss for words. "And you are the voice that reminded me of what hope is," he replied, surprised by his own words. The following days were a revelation for Edward. Mira took him to see the village, introduced him to her aging mother, and showed him the sea she loved so much. They talked about books, dreams, and losses as they walked along the beach at sunset. Edward felt alive like never before, as if all the words he had studied and taught finally held real meaning. On the eve of his departure, they were on the village's small pier, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky and sea red and gold. "I think I understand now why you write the way you do," Edward said. "This place has a beauty that cannot be captured in words, only felt." Mira smiled, her eyes reflecting the flaming sky. "My father used to say that beauty is everywhere, but only a few have the eyes to see it." Edward made a decision at that moment, looking at that simple woman who had awakened something dormant within him. "I will return, Mira. Not even the sea will be enough of a distance." Back in England, Edward felt like a stranger in his own life. The classes, departmental meetings, formal dinners, everything seemed empty and purposeless. His mother noticed the change but attributed it to travel fatigue. After months of intense correspondence and deep reflection, Edward sent a letter unlike any before, an invitation for Mira to come to Oxford, along with a marriage proposal. He knew he was challenging conventions, family expectations, and his own comfort zone, but for the first time, he was following his heart instead of reason. The response took a while to arrive, but when it did, it was simple and direct. "Yes, I will wait for the right wind to sail to you." Mira's crossing was long and difficult. For 5 weeks, she traveled on a cargo ship, sharing space with goods and other passengers seeking a new life in the West. She carried only a suitcase with simple clothes, some books, her father's crucifix, and a small bronze urn with his ashes. On nights on the deck, she wrapped herself in shawls against the increasing cold as they sailed north, looking at the stars and whispering prayers to the wind. She felt fear of the unknown, of the foreign land, of the possibility of rejection. But there was also a quiet certainty in her heart, an intuitive knowledge that she was following the right path. When she finally arrived in England, the sky was heavy with gray clouds, and a fine rain fell incessantly. The cold cut through in a way she had never felt before, penetrating her bones despite the layers of clothing. At the Oxford railway station, Edward waited nervously, wearing a brown coat and holding a black umbrella. Seeing her get off the train, he felt a lump in his throat. Mira seemed small and fragile in that unfamiliar environment, but her eyes shone with the same intensity that had captivated him in Goa. He walked up to her, unable to speak, and simply took her hand. In that silent touch, they both understood that they were beginning a journey much larger and more challenging than crossing the ocean. They married 2 weeks later, in a small chapel on the outskirts of the university. Father Collins, an elderly missionary who had spent years in India and whom Edward had met through the Colonial Studies Department, officiated the ceremony. Mira wore a simple white linen dress with Indian embroidery that she had hurriedly made, and Edward wore a dark suit inherited from his father, along with a family ring that had belonged to his grandfather. No member of the Hawthorne family attended. Margaret had refused to acknowledge the union, sending only a cold note. "You are making a mistake that will stain our family name. Do not count on my presence or approval." But for Mira and Edward, that moment was perfect in its simplicity. Father Collins, with his white hair and face wrinkled by the sun of many continents, smiled as he blessed them. True love knows no bounds of land, sea, or prejudice. May God bless this union and make it a beacon of hope. The years that followed were full of challenges. Oxford, despite its reputation as an intellectual center, proved to be a hostile environment for the unlikely couple. Edward's colleagues treated him with polite detachment, while their wives did not invite Mira to teas or social events. Whispered comments about Professor Hawthorne's exotic wife were common in the university corridors. The university administration, concerned about its reputation, temporarily removed Edward from in-person classes, assigning him to administrative tasks and research that kept him out of the public eye. The official justification was a redistribution of talents, but the implicit message was clear. At home, Mira faced her own isolation. The English she mastered in writing proved more challenging in everyday communication, especially with the local accents. The cold and damp climate caused her joint pains and a persistent cough that took months to adjust to. But the hardest part was the cultural loneliness, the absence of the smells, sounds, and colors of her homeland. However, Mira was not someone who succumbed to despair. With the same determination that had led her to study and teach in her village, she began to build a new life. She set up a small sewing atelier at home, creating pieces that blended Indian aesthetics with Western elements. Soon, some more open-minded students discovered her talent and began ordering shawls and scarves. At the same time, she started calligraphy classes for immigrant children who, like her, struggled to find their place in English society. In the small apartment she shared with Edward, she created a welcoming space where the children could learn not only letters, but also stories from different cultures. Edward, in turn, oscillated between admiration for Mira's strength and a growing sense of guilt for the difficulties she faced because of him. Every closed door, every look of disapproval, weighed on his shoulders. He began working more, taking on extra projects to make up for the loss of prestige at the university. That year's winter was particularly harsh. As snow covered Oxford with its white blanket, the cold seemed to penetrate into the couple's relationship as well. Edward spent entire days in the library, returning late and exhausted. Mira, busy with her own projects, waited patiently, but the emotional distance grew. One morning, Edward received a letter offering him a temporary job at a university in London, a research opportunity that could restore his academic reputation. He decided to accept it, promising Mira it would only be for a few months at most. "I will regain my position, and then we can rebuild our life here, or maybe somewhere else where we are not judged," he explained, holding Mira's hands in his. She nodded, as understanding as ever. "Do what you need to do. I'll be here when you return." The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. Edward's letters, initially frequent and warm, became sparse and formal. Mira wrote religiously every week, sharing the little happenings of her daily life, but replies seldom came. On a particularly cold afternoon, Mira walked to the river that wound through the town. The surface was partly frozen, reflecting the gray sky. From her bag, she took out the small bronze urn that held her father's ashes. After a silent prayer, she opened it and let the wind carry the ashes over the icy waters. "Perhaps love also needs to get a little lost to find its way back," she whispered, recalling the words her father used to say about boats that drift too far from the shore. The years passed. Mira, now 40 years old, had transformed her small classes into an unofficial school for immigrant children. Her English had become fluent. although she never lost the gentle Goan accent that made those who listened to her storytelling smile. She had become known in certain circles of Oxford as the woman who brings warmth with words, a reference both to her narrative skill and her ability to make others feel welcome. Edward returned when he already had gray hair at his temples. 11 years had passed since his departure for London, years that had profoundly changed him. After the initial work, he wandered through various smaller institutions, teaching at small colleges in Scotland and the north of England. He had published several books under a pseudonym, essays, that combined his classical literary education with reflections on diverse cultures and the nature of belonging. When he finally returned to Oxford, it was not to his old university, but directly to the small school Mira had established in the suburbs of the city. He found her in the backyard garden, seated on a wooden bench, teaching a group of children to read using the same seashell and colorful chalk method he had first seen in Goa. Mira looked up and saw him standing by the gate. Her face showed no surprise, just a calm acceptance. She asked the children to continue reading in pairs and walked up to him. For a moment they remained silent, studying each other's faces, the new lines, the gray hairs, the eyes that had seen much since they last met. "You came back," she said simply, her voice as soft as ever. "I always knew the way," he replied, his throat tight with restrained emotions. There were no recriminations, no complex explanations. Both had lived, suffered, and grown separately, and now they were ready to start again, not with the impulsive passion of youth, but with the quiet wisdom of middle age. Edward rented a small cottage on the outskirts of the city, near Mira's school, and began to rebuild his life alongside her. He started assisting with classes, sharing his literary knowledge with the young students, many of whom had never set foot in a formal library. It was during this time that Margaret Hawthorne, now an 80-year-old lady, frail and lonely after years of living only with servants in her large Victorian house, sent a letter asking to meet her daughter-in-law. Her health was deteriorating, and something in her hardened heart had finally softened. Mira received her mother-in-law with the same kindness she extended to everyone. She prepared tea the Indian way, with cardamom and ginger and fresh bread that she had learned to make the English way. Margaret silently observed how the children gathered around Mira during class breaks, listening to stories about Indian princes and English adventurers crossing oceans. "You saved my son," Margaret said finally, tears streaming down her wrinkled face. "And perhaps you have saved me too." From that day onwards, the Hawthorne family began to rebuild itself in an unexpected way. Margaret's old house, once a monument to the past, gradually filled with life. Edward and Mira moved in, bringing with them the welcoming spirit that had characterized the small school. The austere walls were adorned with colorful paintings made by the students. The kitchen, once the exclusive domain of servants, became the heart of the house, infused with the aromas of spices and laughter. On weekends, the formal garden transformed into a stage for small cultural performances organized by Mira for her students and their families. Edward returned to formal teaching, now at a community college that valued his extensive experience. In his classes, he cited both Shakespeare and Indian poets, and often included in his lectures the story of a woman who taught him to listen to the silence and find beauty in unexpected places. Time continued its inexorable course. Over the years, Mira and Edward adopted 3 orphaned children, Amir, who would become a musician, Sophia, who would follow in her father's footsteps as a teacher, and Thomas, who inherited his mother's love for cultivating the land, becoming a respected landscape gardener. 5 decades had passed since that first meeting in Goa. The small fishing village where Mira had grown up transformed into a tourist destination, and the Oxford that had welcomed Edward as a promising young academic now honored him as an emeritus professor. The world had changed drastically, but the essence of what they had built together remained unchanged. Now, at 78 years old, Mira still maintains the serenity that always characterized her. Her hair, completely white, is braided in the same simple way as in her youth. Her hands, marked by time and work, are still gentle as they touch the flowers in the garden or caress the faces of the great-grandchildren who run across the property. Edward, at 85, moves more slowly, supported by a carved cane that he received from a former student. His eyes, however, retain the curious sparkle that led him, decades ago, to respond to that first letter from an unknown Indian teacher. On autumn afternoons, they sit together in the garden, watching the golden leaves fall while their grandchildren and great-grandchildren play among the English rose bushes and the lotus flowers that Mira insisted on planting. An unlikely combination that, like the life they built, blooms despite the odds. When the wind blows stronger, Edward still holds Mira's hand, a gesture that has become as natural as breathing. And she occasionally walks alone to the river where she scattered her father's ashes so many years ago. She stands quietly on the bank, watching the water flow, as if silently conversing with all those who came before and who, in some mysterious way, paved the path for the life she has lived. In the study they share in the old house, on an oak table cluttered with books and manuscripts, there is a framed phrase words Edward wrote many years ago but never published. They both know it by heart. Some loves cross oceans, others build continents. And in the quiet of yet another English evening, surrounded by the legacy of lives intertwined against all odds, Mira and Edward exchange a glance that says more than words, the silent certainty that the journey, with all its storms and calms, was worth every moment.